So, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Valeria Korablyova. I am Senior Research Fellow at Charles University that hosts today's event. This webinar is part of the Anti-War Marathon, an initiative of a group of scholars working at various institutions. And I thank Tatyana Shchetsova for this initiative and for inviting us to join it. I shall start with some quick organizational remarks. This meeting is being recorded, and by continuing to participate, we assume that you agree on that. The recording will be uploaded later and will be available online. The link will be posted in the discussion to this Facebook event. Every speaker will give a short opening statement. Afterwards, we will engage in a general discussion. You may pose your questions in the chat box or raise your hand afterwards. This discussion is meant to be held in Ukrainian and English, although we are open to your suggestions, and that would be to adjust to our audience, but also to reflect the multilingual character of our daily routine. We have a truly stellar set of speakers today, whom I want to cordially thank for accepting the invitation. What all of them have in common, and that is a particular focus of today's conversation, is that they were caught by the Russian full-scale invasion in Ukraine while being outside of the country. The idea is to create this space to talk together about things that we are rarely asked about by journalists or speak in public, namely to reflect on our personal experiences of the war and of our experiences of thinking about the war. In other words, I'm inviting you to reflect to some certain self-reflection endeavor. I would love to talk to you and with you about this experience of the war at a distance, so to speak, something that touches us deeply and immediately, yet is not experienced first-handedly. It is still a traumatic experience, I believe, which we might be ashamed to talk about as we find ourselves in a privileged position of staying in safe environments. But this trauma and this shame should be articulated. And the second line of thinking that I had in mind is that this very privileged, quote unquote, position of having direct access to several, at least cultural environments, might also open some opportunities for us not only to breach several cultures, but also to try to generate some new meanings and interpretive models that might synthesize these different standpoints and maybe demonstrate broader reverberations of this war and its potential more universal readings. So I'm inviting the first speaker. That would be pan Mykola Riabchuk. Mykola Riabchuk є знаний публічний інтелектуал в Україні і один з найбільш послідовних прихильників постколоніального підходу до російсько-українських відносин. Наразі пан Микола є запрошеним дослідником в Institute of Advanced Studies в Парижі, і мені було б дуже цікаво почути про ваш особистий досвід проживання війни у Франції і про досвіди включення в публічний простір французький, який видається досить центрованим цим наративом примирення, цими намаганнями посадити за загальний стіл для обговорення російських і українських інтелектуалів. Отже, пане Миколо, вам слово.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting, for organizing this meeting, and for gathering a very nice team of scholars. Yes, the war caught me in Paris, where I arrived in September with the hope to work on another book within 10 months. The book, ironically, was related to today's event, even though I did not predict the all-out war, but it was about so-called Russo-Ukrainian conflict, about narratives, about international geopolitical discourses on this so-called conflict. So I tried to examine different ideologies which stand behind these discourses. Now, of course, the war contributed some new motifs, new problems to my research, but generally I can continue it in the same line. There is another problem that since February I'm engaged in public relations, so to say. So there are very little time for for academic work, for library and so on, because I have to scroll down the news and I have to produce op-eds, various articles, commentaries, to give interviews, and sometimes to present lectures and participate in roundtables like today. So it's quite a challenge. And for me, it's rather usual thing because I'm workaholic. So my wife says that it's kind of a survivor complex. Maybe yes, survivor not in terms of today's situation, even though we all are survivors here because we are not threatened by Russian rockets and snipers and so on. So we are, in a way, we are lucky people. But we are also survivors generally, because most Ukrainians are survivors because we survived many different calamities. My mother's family died out during the famine of 1933. It was a big family, and she was the only person in that family who survived. The same with my mother-in-law. So really, it's kind of survivors' nation. And of course, probably not only myself, but also many people feel a sort of obligation, sort of duty to work not only for themselves, but also on behalf of all these people who perished and who cannot contribute to our today's struggle, to our eventual victory, I believe. So yes, I have no holidays. I have take no rest. It's really very hard duty, but rather it's rather usual thing for me. The war, of course, complicated many things, and I planned, for example, to travel more often in Ukraine, as I did, for example, in 2013-14. When I was also caught, ironically, at the time, 10 years ago, I also arrived to Vienna for a very similar fellowship, also with another hope to write a book within 10 months. And there was Euromaidan, so at the time, again, I had to be engaged in writing op-eds and talking in PR relations. But it was, of course, easier because country was open and we could shuttle here and back, and it's really was not so threatening, so dangerous, so sinister as it is today. Yes, we have very difficult task. We feel this duty to work harder than ever. France is a very peculiar country because, yes, indeed, it's a society which never understand, never recognized, never cared about Ukraine too much. It was Moscow-oriented traditionally because of imperial affinity, because of many traditional historical contacts and traditions and so. But it changes. I must say that, it maybe not radically. It's not as not seaside sea change as elsewhere, but still it's noticeable. I couldn't imagine so huge attention to Ukraine's development before in French media, newspapers, TV. I couldn't imagine if Eiffel Tower colored in blue and yellow colors of Ukrainian flag, and on and on. Yes, it's really impressive, and sometimes it's moving. But also, of course, there are a lot of misunderstandings. There are a lot of this, Putin versteers, so to say, who try to muddle the water, who try to, again, to promote this idea of reconciliation, dialogue, all this, traditional blah, blah. And of course, also another motif which is very often emerges here, maybe not so often, but emerges from time to time, emerges in mass media, in public discourse, is a motif of Ukraine's far right, Ukraine's fascism, which is, of course, we understand where it comes from, but still it has some support and draw some attention. It's very difficult to fight it back. So yes, we do whatever, as much as we can. I'm not a single Ukrainian here, and not a single specialist in Ukrainian field. But of course, it's not as developed as in the United States or even UK or Germany, not to mention Poland or some other East European countries. So yes and no. My impression is rather ambivalent. On the one hand, I really appreciate support from my French colleagues. I appreciate support from French society, which appeared to be very open and friendly for Ukrainians. But also, of course, my big concern is that this knowledge is insufficient and quite marginal. France is still more interested in the south than in the east of the continent, which is maybe understandable, but of course today's Ukraine situation is quite unique. It's really it's the only war within the past 80 years, and it's the only war which is absolutely unprovoked and carried out by the external aggression. It's really a unique situation which deserves not only support, but also deserves a very powerful response, because it creates very dangerous precedents for the future, for the stability in the entire world. So much for a while.
Thank you so much for this inspiring message that the situation has been changing in France, despite all the sort of resistance, to accept this reality, at least as a first reaction. And also thank you for making this link between the Maidan and the current war, which is, I believe, quite obvious for Ukrainians, but is completely missed by external observers, or at least to a large extent. And of course, this remark that we are a nation of survivors, that Ukrainians are usually very efficient in crisis mobilization and otherwise failing to have this unity under the peaceful conditions. So thank you. I hope we will continue a follow up on that. But right now we will move from France to Sweden, and I want to give the floor to Dr. Yuliya Yurchuk. Yuliya is now based in Sweden, University of Umea, and is a historian working in the field of memory studies. So I wonder, you have worked a lot about historic traumas, and therefore you have a proper analytical toolkit to analyze traumatic experiences. So I wonder if it is of any use under the current conditions, and maybe you would find it possible to talk about your own personal experience. I can start with my personal trauma. I remember being invited to comment live in the news at Czech television, CNN Prima. It was on Saturday, February 26th, and I was astonished by my bodily reaction. Somehow I could not hear properly. I had this tunnel vision, and all that I know, it is a traumatic response on the physical level when your psychic system is working like in a very specific mode. And later on, I was talking to colleagues also based in different Western institutions, and some of them lost their appetite after reports from Bucha and Mariupol. Some were scared of flying airplanes and any like loud sounds and so on, which certainly testifies to a sort of trauma which should not be compared to trauma of those who are currently in Ukraine. However, I believe that talking about that does not diminish other traumas, but rather it exposes the scope of traumatic experiences we will have to deal with later. So if anything of that resonates with you, please comment on that. The floor is yours, Yuliya.
Thank you, Valeria, and thank you for everyone who are joining us, and thank you for all the speakers. It's really my honor to be with you today. And as a scholar who is studying memory, I feel like really everything I read before now experiencing myself. It's a very kind of strange situation, and all this tunnel vision and all these traumatic responses, they switched on directly on the 24th of February, and I lived through this kind of 4 days which I couldn't even remember how they passed. And then I started eating again, and I started functioning again, and I of course understood what is happening, but still being in this situation is very, very hard. And I cannot even imagine what people on the ground were going through. And for some, it's not ending after 2 months, after 8 years, right? And it's just horrible to think about all this. And I will maybe continue by linking what Mykola Riabchuk just said about this survival strategies, because even the science of this neuroscience is saying us that memory is kind of evolutional mechanism. We survive because we have memory. We have memory how to survive, and this war also showed on the example of my family how these memory mechanisms as survival work. Because in my family, I was optimistic. I still hoped that the big invasion won't happen. But my husband, he was prepared. He already bought everything, what he thought he would need when the war will start. So when the 24th of February came, we already had a lot of military stuff at home, and we could really directly send everything to Ukraine. And that was exactly at that moment that I thought that this is kind of memory in work. So this is like, he was prepared that Russia will be ready for this war. And then I spoke to one of my friends, and she said, you know what, I was waiting for this war from 1939. Of course, she was not even born then, but her grandmother went through all the war. She was in this underground resistance, underground army in Ukraine. You all know UPA, right? And this grandchild now, she said, I was waiting for this war. I knew it will come, but I didn't know when. So I think this shows a lot about how our collective memory even works, not only memory of one individual. And when the war, this big war started, as I said, I was a bit lost for several days, and the only thing I could think about was that what I can do, I can be kind of a platform for Ukrainian voices. And a lot of people from Ukraine, my friends from Ukraine, were messaging me and asking, you should write that, you should write this, you should, because they believed if I am in the West, then I can kind of say the truth to the West, which is of course exaggerating my power. But I did what I could. I just write what I could. And the first thing what I did publicly was to organize a film screening of Irina Tsilik's film, because I thought that this is exactly the time when Ukrainian voices has to be heard. And this is also interesting because I was contacted by the university and they asked me to think about something what can be interesting for the audience to tell something about Ukraine. And they asked me, maybe it can be Loznitsa's film. And I said, but why Loznitsa? Why? My goodness, we have so many other good directors. And of course, they didn't have anything bad in their mind. They really wanted something Ukrainian. And I said, yeah, if you want something Ukrainian, I will do something, but it won't be Loznitsa. And it was the first public event that I organized. And then I kind of started going to some media to write something. And what also helped that with my husband, we organized collecting money campaign, and we really collected so much money for a couple of days. We collected 100,000 krona, which is 10,000 euro. It's not a lot, but for one individual, it's a lot. And then we had a call from our bank and they said, you should stop it. So it also tells a lot about Sweden, right? You should stop it because you as an individual, you cannot do it because we cannot trace the money. So for Sweden, it's very big deal to not be able to trace the money. So we said, but we are Ukrainians. They said, we understand you very well, you are Ukrainians, but please don't do it because it's not okay. You have to have some kind of company or NGO or something to do it. But it helped for the first weeks, like for us. But I also understand that like to be a volunteer, it's like a full-time job really, and I appreciate all the people who are doing it, because my husband had to take leave for 1 month to do it because it was not possible to combine with any kind of work. And if we at the university are working, you know, kind of the load we have of all this teaching, it's not possible to combine with anything. So I really appreciate now all the volunteers, what they are doing. It's just amazing, really. And like, of course, I was studying this nationalist movement, right? I was studying the memory of nationalist movement. I was studying what Russia made into the cause of war, right? And my reaction to all the media, I just said that I won't comment it because, I mean, all these years, for 8 years, we were trying to convince like everyone that Ukrainians are not like Nazis. If we are even like waving the flags of red and black, it doesn't mean that we are Nazis. And you all know this, right? My whole dissertation is about like why democratic forces in Ukraine are using the memory of undemocratic movement of the Second World War. So I decided that it's not really relevant now to even speak about it, because you kind of will promote this kind of very crazy Putin's Russian logics into the media agenda. And as far as I know, all my colleagues who were asked about this Nazism and the Nazis in Ukraine, they all said no. So there was no discussions on Swedish media about this. And I must say that for Sweden, I think that I was lucky enough that I am in Sweden, because Sweden is kind of united and in solidarity with Ukraine. And I think here history and memory also plays a role, because in Sweden there is this huge kind of feeling of what it's called, like a Swedish Russian fear. Like they are afraid of Russians. Like historically, they are afraid of Russian is enemy. And I think that during this war in Ukraine, they finally saw that it also can be a threat to them. And so it was not the situation like in Germany or in France. It was more a united solidarity, which I saw. And I'm very happy that all my friends also supported me to survive, at least during these first weeks, which were very, very hard. And also, I think that what is also interesting for me, and what is important for me in Sweden, to see that all the universities are also united in solidarity with Ukraine. And I didn't see this kind of programs which are addressed equally to Ukrainian students and to Russian students. We have really like separate politics towards Ukrainian students, Ukrainian researchers, and I think this is important also. Yeah, I can stop here and we'll proceed.
Many thanks, Yuliya, for doing what you have been doing together with your husband, and especially for sharing about it now. I hear from you, and I believe that it's valid for many of us, that doing something like very practical and very like with very obvious results, it's a very good recipe to kill this anxiety and these sort of traumatic, weird states of mind. And that brings me to the next speaker, who would be my fellow colleague from Charles University, Radomyr Mokryk. Radomyr had lived in Prague for a while, and I would say had been very well integrated in the Czech society. However, after February 24th, he made a decision to go back to Ukraine. And now he, as he mentioned before, now he writes prolifically for Czech media, some like big, Enlightenment style articles about Ukraine. So Radomyr, if you would like to share how you made this decision and how it feels from inside in Ukraine, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for inviting me. Actually, I'm, as it was said, in a bit different situation because actually, really, I'm in Ukraine from the very first day of the war. But I do write a lot, and I'm trying to explain what is going on in the Czech medias. So I would like to say just a couple of words as I do see this narratives and what is going on in Czech public opinion and medias, first of all, and then probably share some personal things about it. First of all, I do think that as it was said, actually, as Yuliya Yurchuk said, I think it's a very right time for Ukrainian voice to be heard. So, and I do think that it's the right time to at least try to explain that this war is a colonial war, actually, and that this war is just another level, another chapter of Russian war against Ukraine, to explain the origins and the reasons of the current war, because as I do see, for example, in Czech Republic, there are a lot of people who still think that it's about like NATO threat or some biological weapons and so on and so forth. So I do think that this is the right moment to write something, yeah, as you said, Enlightenment texts, and to explain the deep origins, historical and cultural origins of this conflict. And that's exactly what I'm just trying to do right now. I haven't seen a lot of articles in Czech media working with this narrative, but I'm pretty convinced that this is the right approach right now for us. First of all, of course, some of these texts were published in the West. For example, Timothy Snyder, I guess, just a couple of days ago in the New Yorker published an article about the colonial essence of this war. And it's, of course, it's good to stress that, like, you see Professor Snyder, Professor Plochy just published an article about the Russian colonialism. So this is the right approach. And I guess it's important to work with it right now, because otherwise it could happen that the West, the public opinion in the West, people in the West will think that this is Putin's war, and this is absolutely, this is not correct, and this is even dangerous. I think it's important to explain that this is Russians war in Ukraine. So this is the first thing. The second is when I look at social medias, for example, in Czech Republic, I do see that probably the main narrative of Russian propaganda looks like who knows, everyone lies. So we do not know what actually is going on in Ukraine, and so on and so forth. I have this advantage being in Ukraine for last weeks. Now I'm in Lviv, but I've visited Kyiv for a couple of times. I've been to Bucha, I've been to Borodyanka, I've been to Irpin. I've seen all these graves. I've talked to local people. I've been in the houses where actually Russians were living for a couple of weeks. Tomorrow, actually, we are leaving to Odessa because it seems like this beautiful city could be the next target of Russian aggression, and I will try to see what's going on in the city and to talk to people there. So it's what I'm trying to say. It's extremely important to have this argument, yeah, that I've been here, I've seen this, I have relatives there, I have friends in these cities, and so this information is relevant and 100 correct, yeah, because you can just argue that you've seen it by your own eyes, or at least you have some relatives there. This is about the information war. And the third important thing, I guess, it's what actually sounded here 2 times about the Nazis. Yes, in Czech Republic, this Nazi narrative is still rather strong, because when I was on the TV in Czech Republic, the main actually TV programs in Czech Republic, all the time, every time journalists were asking me about, like, yeah, okay, we understand, but what about the Nazis? What about Azov? Yeah, and like, geez, are you serious? Yeah, we are talking about Mariupol. Yeah, we are talking about this great disaster that is going on right now online. But the question still is, okay, this Azov battalion, so what is wrong with them? And so I do understand that it's really annoying nowadays to take part in such a discussions. But I do think that it's still important right now to talk and to explain this, why Russia is using this Nazis, fascists narrative, and actually to explain that Russia itself probably now gained some features of Nazi state much more than Ukraine, if we are talking about Nazi ideology and so on and so forth. So these are probably this 3 key points that I was going to share with you about this media discourses in Czech Republic, as I do see it. What about my personal experience? I actually, you mean the first days of the war? I actually do not know what to say, because I just realized, in some sense, after this Putin's speech, the February 22nd, yeah, I guess 2 days before the full-scale invasion, it was this horrific speech by Russian president, and I just realized that probably this is the right time to come home. Yeah, and that's it. And I'm actually absolutely happy about this decision, because I think it's extremely complicated, I mean, and emotional to be abroad, to stay abroad while such things are going in Ukraine, and I'm just happy to be here. That's it.
Thank you, Radko. That was like really very moving when you said that it was time to go back home after being like well integrated in the Czech society, as I mentioned before. And again, you pointed out the same that Yuliya mentioned, these persistent narratives of Kremlin propaganda that we should not engage altogether, even to discredit them, because by the very fact of talking about that seriously, we validate them. So it's still an open question how to fight, how to combat this propaganda in the most efficient way. But since we talk a bit about media, I think it's very logical to turn to Bektour Iskender now. I met Bektour quite a few years ago in Prague Civil Society Center, and I was impressed by his Ukrainian language skill and by his personal engagement into the Ukrainian case. And for me, it was very important to invite Bektour to this conversation, because we Ukrainians these days talk a lot about the need to decolonize our thinking and our practices, but at the same time, our thinking remains largely Eurocentric. And I believe that we ignore Central Asian context altogether. And since Bektour comes from Kyrgyzstan, I think it would be very useful for us to hear his take. He's a very active civic entrepreneur and a founder of KLOOP project of investigative journalism, which covers developments in the region. Also, he gives TED Talks and he works with audience and social media quite efficiently. So I see how he promotes the idea of decolonization and what harsh resistance he meets with his audience. So if you would like to share something about that, Bektour, we will appreciate that. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me well, by the way?
Yep.
Thank you, Valeria. I should add that my Ukrainian has become even better since last time we met. Also, because I moved to Ukraine last year, actually, and I've been living in Kyiv, and I still pay for my rent for my apartment in Kyiv. Although I'm currently not in Ukraine, but I left Ukraine to return. This is a complicated story, but I'll come back to that a bit later. And as Valeria mentioned, I'm from Kyrgyzstan. I'm one of the founders of a media organization called KLOOP. And we've been mostly famous for our work in Kyrgyzstan. But at some point, I started having this very, very strong connection with Ukraine. I first traveled to Ukraine in 2010 when I was an observer at presidential elections, where Yanukovych won, unfortunately. And I was an observer in Donetsk. So Donetsk was my first Ukrainian city, which was quite an experience, I should say, because I feel like I was happy to see Donetsk how it was before, the war started in 2013, because then it made much more sense for me when following, what was happening after that, to actually understand deeper the context of how things were developing. And I would return to Ukraine many times, and I don't even know how many times I have been in Ukraine, but this is definitely the country where I spent most of my time, except for Kyrgyzstan, my home country. I witnessed most of historical events. I was a journalist at Euromaidan. I covered the war when it started in 2014. I was in Donetsk in May 14, when the war broke out, shortly after it had been broken out. And then I returned to occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. I've been to 12 regions of Ukraine. So I think I can say that I probably learned Ukraine pretty well, I've been to so many places. And then at some point I decided, okay, it's probably time to live in Ukraine because I really love the country. And what we plan to do with our organization is to build a safety hub in Kyiv for Central Asian journalists. We started working on that last year. The idea was that we would bring some of the bravest investigative journalists from Central Asia to Ukraine, first of all, so that they would be able to live in a safer space without a fear of being attacked or arrested, and also to build more networks between journalists of Ukraine, also of Belarus, and there were many journalists from Belarus in Kyiv since 2020, and also to start building, these networks of what I call post-colonial solidarity. Because one of the reasons why I have been traveling to Ukraine so much and why I decided to move to Ukraine was because Ukraine has always been a very inspirational example for me as a person from Kyrgyzstan, a country which actually has a very similar historical context when it comes to colonization. I mean, we were colonized by the same empire. We went through similar horrifying practices that Russians would do against us. We had the same history of our native languages being, limited. I mean, probably I should use stronger words about that, but anyway. And at the same time, what I was feeling really sad about is that since we became independent, there was not so much interest in Kyrgyzstan about Ukraine and about what was going on. And well, the same actually happened in Ukraine, because whenever I would come to some public event or give a talk somewhere in Ukraine, quite often I would be the first person from Kyrgyzstan that my audience would ever meet. But then when we would start talking and when we would start sharing our experiences, ranging from current experiences, but also to experiences that were shared with us by our parents, grandparents, and so on, we would be amazed by, first of all, how much of a common pain we share, but at the same time, how much of common achievements we do have. And I decided at some point that I would want to dedicate some significant part of my life to building, this platform which would allow us to exchange the best practices that our countries had since we became independent, to build much more cooperation on the grassroots level between the civil societies of Kyrgyzstan and Ukraine, and not only Kyrgyzstan and Ukraine. I mean, whole Central Asia is interesting, and Caucasus countries are very interesting as well. We understand each other so well when we start speaking to each other. So first, my idea was to solve this problem, that we should start speaking to each other, I was in Ukraine when this full-scale invasion started. I didn't want to leave Ukraine because, I still had these plans of safety hub in Kyiv and so on. Then my colleagues told me, okay, probably safety hub in Kyiv is not happening this year. Let's temporarily do it in Poland, maybe, and then we'll move it back to Ukraine, when Ukraine is safer. But let's do something else. Let's actually bring Central Asian journalists to Ukraine to cover the war. Something to what I have personally done, similar to what I have personally done in 2014, 2015, but on a larger scale. And in order to organize it, you probably should leave Ukraine first to collect resources. That's what they told me. To collect resources, to organize everything, to prepare yourself and also journalists who you want to bring, and so on. So yeah, I had to leave Ukraine in order to start preparing for this. And I'm coming back in a month, I hope, when we gather this group of journalists, because currently there are 0 journalists from Central Asia in Ukraine. And at the same time, what has been going on in Ukraine since 2014 has been affecting our country so much, because when Russia understood that it's losing its influence on Ukraine's domestic politics, for example, it switched a lot of attention to us. They started promoting some insane legislation in my country. They tried to promote the same law on foreign agents, which fortunately our parliament members voted against. They started interfering a lot into, the way our society is structured, and I hate it, and I really want to fight against it. And I, at the same time, want to explain to people in my country what actually is going on in Ukraine. I want to change this narrative. I want to free my people from this influence of Russian propaganda, which unfortunately is quite strong in Kyrgyzstan. And yeah, so basically this is one of my main missions right now, is to gather journalists from Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan as well, in Poland first, to get them prepared, to equip them with all the necessary safety gear, and then board a train to Lviv, and then to Kyiv, and then they will go wherever they think they will need to go. I will stay in Kyiv and save them in case they need it. Basically, this will be my job. But I can't wait for it to happen, because I mean, since this full-scale invasion started, I was, of course, horrified by what was going on. And as I said, I didn't want to leave Ukraine. I had to go to Poland first, and I was absolutely losing interest to everything that was going on, except except for what was going on in Ukraine. Now when I have this motivation of coming back, this really makes me happy, and I can't wait for the day when I cross the border and enter Ukraine. And I hope that it will change a lot in terms of this post-colonial solidarity, which I think should only become stronger between our countries. I think I would end here.
Thank you so much. What a sad irony that you imagined Kyiv as a safety hub for Central Asian journalists, but I hope someday it will. I mean, I cannot sympathize enough with the whole project of post-colonial solidarity, that different colonial subjects of the Russian Empire should somehow stick together and learn from each other. Very important. And also this personal touch that you are still paying your rent in Kyiv, that really moved me. So that's a very nice kind of feature.
Sorry, I disappeared for a while. Did you hear me till the end, or?
Yes,
I don't know.
yes. It was like perfect timing of disappearing, because once you disappeared, I started talking. So I think we
Okay.
are
Thank you.
like playing together quite well. So thanks again for your input here. And we are moving now from media to the cultural domain. And I want to give the floor to Antonina Stebur, who is now based in Berlin, the Berlin University of the Arts. Antonina is an art critic and curator. And I wonder how these interests click. I believe that the Ukrainian dimension of war, or the Ukrainian experience of war, is very strong emancipatory and decolonial dimension. So I wonder, from your perspective, how these experiences of resistance in Belarus and Ukraine converge here, and also how these resistances may be reflected in cultural production. So Antonina, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, the place I'm speaking from is very problematic, or maybe problematic is not very good words, but maybe it's very complicated, because as Valeria said, I'm from Belarus, but the last year I lived in Kyiv because I left Belarus because of the political repression. And now right now I'm in Warsaw, yes, but I'm going to move to Berlin in university. But I totally, in the Belarusian context, we very often compare Belarusian protest and the war, but for me, it's very uncomparable things. Because in my personal perspective, I can say that during the protest, the Belarusian protest 2020, 2021, I wrote many texts. I was very active in research and curatorial point of view. I took part in, I don't know, many discussions, and it was vice versa when the war started, because I was engaged and numb. I couldn't write anything. I couldn't took part in any discussion. And to tell the truth, it's my first public discussion of the war, because I felt myself as I lose language at all. And and as Yuliya said, I also paid attention in volunteer works. And of course, as Valeria said, it was amazing for me how this structure of help, or structure of resistance that we created as Belarusians during the protest, or even earlier. Because, for example, when we speak about Belarusian independent soldiers that took part in war on the side of Ukraine, their troops named by the Belarusian revolutionary Kossuth-Kalinovsky, who fought against the Russian invasion in Belarus. These troops also took part, not the same people, but infrastructure, took part in the beginning of the war. I mean in 2014 in Donbass and Lugansk, also with the Ukrainian soldiers. And so when the war started, they also rebirth, and took part and take part now in with Ukrainian soldiers. But as for me, I also during the Belarusian protest also did a lot of activistic work, because my curatorial and research focus is connected with activistic practice in contemporary art. So I had a huge connection with human rights organization and activists movements, not only in Belarus. And during the Belarusian protest, we created with lawyers, human rights organization, and IT specialists, we created call center for survival, for survivors. And unfortunately, before in the end of 2021, we frozen this project. And of course, when the war started, we also reopened this project. We found NGO in Ukraine. It is Euromaidan source and the Center of Civil Initiatives, and together we created the same call center for victims, for survivors, to help that they can get information and can help to find right initiatives for helping, for evacuation, and so on. I really took part, and I can see, but I unfortunately, as Yuliya say, to work as a volunteer, to work as an activist, it means it's like a full-time job. I haven't enough time to reflect it. I haven't distance to think about it in like a researcher, not like activist. And so to tell the truth, I'm focused on help. I was focused on helping how we can help. Moreover, Ukraine was the first place country where Belarusians right away the Lukashenko regime and escape their political repression. And today there are many Belarusians stay in Ukraine, or today on the border help with migrants and refugees and so on. And so it's amazing how this infrastructure of care, infrastructure of helping, and infrastructure of resistance that was existed during the Belarusian protest, or even earlier, as I mentioned, then can adopted very fast to the situation of war. And as my colleagues, I totally sure that this war is colonial war, and because Russia took part, or not started, the war around East country from 90s, and to try to manage other countries, to control them. And Belarus is also an example how more or less that this country not occupied by how to say the euro, but they occupied it de facto. And so it's very important to reflect in this point of view as so it's very important to reflect about in this term. And what's and maybe only several weeks ago, I found I don't know, I found time, and I found language to start to think about all this situation, because together with my Ukrainian colleagues who also works in contemporary art, we created anti-war coalition art. It means that international coalition of cultural workers against the war in Ukraine. It's it's an open online platform that collected and shares statements, contemporary art statements against war created by artists from all over the world. And that's very important for us, because our goal is to show that this war is a more complex, has their very complex global context. So it's very important. It was very important for us that in this coalition enjoyed many artists, not only from Ukraine, but also from all over the world, from for example, from Latin American countries, or for example, from Serbia or Bosnia, because it helped us to understand this or for example, from Georgia, because they, as Bektour said, we have like Kyrgyzstan, or for example, Georgia, or Belarus and Ukraine, we have the strong common colonial context. So, and that's, I think that it's very important to think about it and to discuss it, because it helps understand that it's not it helps to understand that it's not only that it's, how to say, is systematic action that made Russian. It's not like just one war. This war started, the series of war that started from 90s. And to tell the truth, if we can say it started much more earlier, from the beginning of this country. So it's very important to understand and to get together this experience and to think about it. Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you, Antonina, for your input. Again, I heard this sort of confirmation of the war as a traumatic experience, because you said that the first reaction after the war, it was like a radical impossibility to continue your professional activities as usual, right? So the first reaction is that we do not have that space for slow thinking, distant thinking to produce whether academic or cultural projects, right? And therefore we engage in some practical here and now volunteer or other initiatives. And now I will turn to Kateryna Botanova, who is a co-curator of the cultural festival CULTURESCAPES in Basel, Switzerland, and a public intellectual with a sound voice in Ukraine and beyond. And we keep talking, I hear it from every speaker, that it is definitely a colonial war. However, we do not know how to overcome this post-colonial reading in the West, which is not necessarily pro-Russian, but often is Russia-mediated or using the knowledge produced in Russia on Ukraine. And when I was listening to this excellent panel in Warsaw last Friday that you participated in, Kateryna, you were sharing your experience, how you talk to your fellow intellectuals in the West, that for them, this scale of tragedy is just too hard to swallow, and maybe the right approach to reach out to them, to close, like to open up this hermetic domain, is not to suggest some big theoretical concepts or abstract visions, but rather to go to personal experience that could resonate with them personally. So if you could further elaborate on that, I'm curious to hear more. Kateryna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Valeria, and thank you very much for organizing this meeting, which at least for me is a very therapeutical experience. You know, we're talking about trauma. We have to take care of trauma, and talking to people, most of whom I know and deeply respect and also miss because we haven't seen each other for quite some time. It is very healing and it's very helping. And I also think it's very, again, therapeutical to be able to speak with people with whom we don't have to explain to each other, you know, the ghost of nationalism, or the importance of talking about, you know, the coloniality of this war, or imperial character of the Russian state, or decoloniality of knowledge that I guess all of us to a different extent are being engaged with. It brings me to another memory of another therapeutical experience we just had a few days ago. I came from Warsaw. In Warsaw, there was a conference, two-day conference called Aftermaths of the War. And that was the first time in this 2 months where I could meet in person, live, not on the screen, with, again, quite some of the colleagues from Ukraine whom I love and miss, and some of them are even here in this Zoom, I see them. And that was an amazing experience on one hand, because we were speaking Ukrainian finally, and I understood it was the first time in 2 months when I would publicly speak in Ukrainian, because all the other public speaking and writing, which was happening, you know, during the 2 months, was English or English-German. And being with the people there and, you know, being able to hug them, being able to talk to them, to see their eyes, was actually something absolutely unbelievable, which I think a part of, at least on my side, a part of a trauma of being outside of Ukraine in this time, that the experiences that we have or that I have are very much mediated even, as close as we can get, with reading or talking to people we love, to see information, being able to connect to it in a different way than our colleagues from the West, but it's still a mediated experience. But seeing people in person and hearing how they speak and how different they react to different kind of news that arrive at the moment, because we were exactly in Warsaw on last Thursday when Kyiv was warm again. That creates a different, or opens a different sensitivity. And another important part about that experience was that among other friends and colleagues whom I met in Warsaw was Ukrainian artist Alevtina Kahidze, with about whom and about her work I wrote extensively also in these last 2 months, because she spent all the time in her house in a Kyiv suburb in Muzychi, drawing every day, drawing her experiences of the war, and her real and imagined conversation with Russian and Western artists and intellectuals about the war, about the nature of this war, about Russian culture and canceling Russian culture and all that. So Alevtina left her house for the first time since the beginning of the war to go to Venice Biennale and then to Warsaw. And before we met in the evening, she wrote me that she would be very happy to see me, and that from the experience in Venice, talking and meeting also friends in Europe, she felt that those who are outside the country are in great pain. And then she wrote me, I will try to cure you. Я буду тебе лікувати. And that is a bit of a magic of an experience, that people who survived and who lived through so much more than not just that I did, but I can even imagine, they still have not even a capacity, but a need to step closer and say, I want to cure you, because I feel that what you're going through is something different and maybe bigger than what I do. And I think this is an amazing quality of a Ukrainian society, and what we do individually, what we do together, this care and cure and solidarity, which started a long time ago, but became of a different quality, I think, during Maidan and after Maidan, with the first beginnings of this war. And now creating this network of support, without which I think the country would not survive, probably, at least on an emotional and a personal level. And I don't know, I keep thinking about it, and I think it will really help and support me in all this, as Mykola said, public relations that I'm doing, as we're all doing, because the challenge of this public relations is that we have to talk in a very different way to very different kinds of people. And one kind of people they really want to help and support. And I think I'm pretty lucky, because in the Swiss situation, those people are many. Many colleagues, many cultural institutions, many media, they really quite full-heartedly want to help. They just don't know how. And they're actually, again, open enough to ask and to sort of show care. But the people that are in Switzerland or in Europe might come to Switzerland, but also about people who are in Ukraine. But the other kind of people are people who care to a certain extent. And there I will probably disagree, Valeria, with you a little bit, because those people are not necessarily thinking in terms of Russia propaganda or Russian mediated discourse about the war. They are thinking in their own very much Western colonial approach to Ukraine and to Eastern Europe in general, which is based basically still on a Cold War terms, and still based on so much on anti-American, anti-imperialism, that the idea that anti-imperialism can be kind of twofold. It's not only against the US, but it can also be against Russia. And those stories, they meet somehow, and they're not necessarily contradicting each other. With those people and I think most of us here had this experience, a lot of this experience, unfortunately. That's really hard to deal with. But I think I also found a little key of understanding, talking to also German living in Swiss colleague of mine who is an activist, who is running a street magazine, who is a journalist herself, coming from a very sort of strong German left intellectual tradition. Because in our discussions and our fights, which we had kind of a few, she said that she's actually happy that in all this complexity of the situation, especially about the heavy weapons delivery to Ukraine, she doesn't have to make a decision. And for me, that was a little key, that most of those people really don't have to make a decision, and they don't understand what they say publicly, what they print in media, what they say at the discussions, what they kind of mention in a public talks, that those words matter, those arguments matter, those open letters matter. But basically what's behind them is this feeling, well, but I don't have to make a decision. You know, my government does, and I will just sort of just express what I have to express, understanding that, well, in any case, it's not my decision. So there are people dying, and, the trouble which is happening, it's somewhere far away, but, I'm just being with my intellectual position, but the responsibility is not on me, which is also, I think, important trick to understand, that many people, and also our colleagues, absolutely respected and important, they've grown in a situation for years, for decades, where the decision making and actually understanding how fast the situation can change, the political, social situation can change, and how what you do or you don't do actually really does influence the situation and has a very practical and political and a personal impact. And this is also, it's a different tempo of life and different temporality. With those people, they can offer to to write an article really fast, but then it will be published in a month and a half. And you say, well, but the situation changed already drastically. But in this world, it's it's not a key argument. Or I remember I was a bit in a shock when I was invited to a podium discussion in Zurich in the early days of March, and the discussion would be on the 20th of April. And I said, guys, how is it possible? I mean, come on, 20th of April, the war will be over by that time. Unfortunately, the war was not over, but it's also different tempo of talking and understanding the changes, and then the impact of the war on the human lives. And finally, referring to a question, Valeria, in my experience, I do mostly relate to personal stories, also a bit coming back to Alevtina and her care. And I do see that talking with writing for different audiences in the European West, the personal stories and personal experiences help, because something which people think they understand intellectually, and they have completely framework they're set to understand, or they think they understand, when they go on the level not just of awful stories in the media or awful pictures from Bucha or Mariupol, but very small and personal experience of very concrete people who lost their houses, who lost their families, who lost their possibilities to talk or to work. That does work, that does connect. And I think we should not forget that all the people we talk to, or we work with, or we write for, they're still human beings. And this moment of caring and curing is also part of our job. Thank you.
Thank you so much for highlighting this humanistic aspect. I think it is very important for us to meet, to see and hear each other, and cure each other by the very fact of talking and recognizing each other indeed. And what you mentioned is a very valid point, that it's not always about being Russophile or somehow engage in some big propaganda or other agendas, but often about being egocentric or just comfortable in their small world and stonewalling from this uncomfortable information coming from Ukraine, which they might not care that much about. And we still need to think how to break through this wall. And now, before turning to the last speaker, I want to remind our audience that you can use the chat box to post your questions. We are slowly running out of time, so I will do my best maybe to combine several questions, or we will see, maybe we will take a bit longer to talk. I'm enjoying our discussion, and I use this opportunity to thank again all of the speakers. And now I'm turning to Vitaly Chernetsky. We talked a lot about the European experience, and now I wonder what is happening in the States and in the North American academia generally. We all, to a certain extent, think about decolonization, but you are very well established as a theoretician, right, of the post-colonial approach. And as far as I see that the post-colonial approach to Eastern Europe exists quite separately to the classical post-colonial approach, which is very much based on anti-Western resentment and quite sympathetic to Russia. I see that it's slowly changing, at least with post-colonial scholars in Eastern Europe. However, we've seen a parade of dubious statements by Western leftist intellectuals recently, be that Judith Butler or Noam Chomsky, or Jürgen Habermas, that is widely debated. So I wonder, do you see any openings in the post-colonial studies for the Ukrainian perspective to be seriously recognized and included? The floor is yours, Vitaly. Thank you for accepting the invitation and for being with us.
Thank you so much, Valeria, and thanks to all the colleagues who spoke before me and to all the audience members. I'm really glad that we're having this conversation today, and many important topics were already brought up, that observations to which I can personally relate. I was especially moved by Kateryna just talking about Alevtina Kahidze, as I hosted Kateryna as an artist in residence here at the University of Kansas in the fall. And this was an opportunity to get to know this wonderful artist whom I first met thanks to Kateryna more than 20 years ago, that, you know, we are continuing this wonderful collaboration. And indeed, her speaking from a personal experience has had a huge impact. And the many people in the artistic community that she met here in the US in the fall are now retranslating and reflecting and using that to give a different dimension of an understanding of the war. As for the situation in the US, I think there are several different aspects. And speaking from personal experience, I can totally fully relate to what several colleagues said before, that the first days of the war, I felt absolutely shell-shocked. My body was reacting violently. Things were just not coming together. At the same time, I started receiving calls from media, especially from local television stations here in the Kansas City area, who wanted to talk. And I granted all the interviews I could. The only interview I received to grant was Fox News, because I told them that as long as Tucker Carlson, one of their notorious show hosts, is continuing to regurgitate Putin talking points, I would not be appearing on the same channel. But I agreed to interviews from all the others. The problem was that early on, it was more asking about how I feel. So it was almost bordering on pornography of suffering. So somehow providing material for some sort of dubious emotional titillation for certain people. And it did feel like a bit of an exploitative approach, especially when the journalist was trying to coax tears out of me. And as soon as the recording stopped, it was almost like when Harry met Sally, when notorious sort of, you know, the famous Meg Ryan episode when she completely switches. I mean, I've had several experiences like that, and it was a bit of an unpleasant feeling afterward. But in terms of intellectual responses, I would say, overwhelmingly, my personal experience has been positive in that there were many colleagues who were trying to reach out to fulfill the gaps in their knowledge, to understand, who understood that they were looking at the world, especially at the territory of the former Russian Empire, including exclusively through the Moscow-centric lens. And it was the development of that feeling of otherness and solidarity that was especially welcome. There were, of course, folks who before then criticized me those kind of approaches and frameworks. So I was really grateful, for instance, for Edyta Boyanovska from Yale University, a colleague that many here know well, for her critique of Russian imperial discourse. She invited me to give a talk at Yale, helping to share the Ukrainian perspective with the audience there. And Yale, while it has wonderfully Timothy Snyder and others in history, still does not have a Ukrainian presence in the Slavic languages and literatures department. So speaking within the Slavic department world, in generally, the more problematic space would be not all, but some of the dominant, Russian literature specialists who are really having trouble addressing the fact that they're, teaching the familiar texts of Russian classics as if nothing happened is no longer possible. There are some who are trying to rethink how one can still continue teaching Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, but through a critical lens. But the general sort of domination of the Russia-centric paradigm within the field has not still been fully challenged. The challenge is happening, and there are discussions, and there are strong voices coming, and it's great to have these kind of allies and the solidarity network, and we are really grateful to all of them. And there is, of course, a lot of voices of solidarity from within the broader field of other colleagues of non-imperial background, but also very importantly, Russian colleagues who are understanding that this needs to yield the speaking space. But it creates a situation that has its own pitfalls and complications, and that there is the demand, please tell us everything we need to know, preferably in 1 hour, and the large number of invitations to be the token Ukrainian representative on some sort of panels and so on and so forth. So this is where I found, and if I have the privilege, I believe I am, I just wanted to show for a second this wonderful cover of the anthology I strongly recommend, the Routledge Handbook of Epistemic Injustice. And I'm going to stop the share. And just the very concept of epistemic injustice, I think, is very important. It's the meeting of political philosophy and ethics. And this is something that indeed has a strong presence in post-colonial studies, because Gayatri Spivak and Candace Subaltern famously speaks of epistemic violence that is being done towards the colonized subjects. And Walter Mignolo, one of the leading decolonial theorists, talks about epistemic injustice and epistemic disobedience a lot in his writing. But if we look at the systematizing approaches, for instance, the article by one of the co-editors of this volume, the philosopher Gail Polhouse, she talks about other things that are important part of this cluster. And one of them is the question of epistemic trust, who is trusted to be the producer and deliverer of knowledge, and also epistemic exploitation. This is precisely the situation of being the token speaker. And this is where I can relate to, for example, a lot to the experience within social justice protests, for instance, of Slavists of color, who were then all asked to help enlighten the folks who are not of color about their perspectives, about their exclusion from the field, about all the obstacles that they have set. And there's the inevitable situation of burnout that is creating a huge problem. But we, in this situation, of course, all of us, I think, in the field of Ukrainian studies feel huge burnout too, but we somehow try to marshal, all those last vapors in the engine and continue running, and indeed speaking out and helping enlighten colleagues. But I think by complicating the situation by indeed challenging the perspectives that we see emerging, like the defensive posture of those who are entrenched in the position of authority, who are used to looking at things from a certain Russia-centric worldview, and who just feel right now sad that they can no longer travel in good conscience to Russia and experience the things that they've really enjoyed. So for many of them, this is more of a feeling of inconvenience with guilt, but that guilt does not necessarily always translate into serious, meaningful efforts to restructure the field, to reckon with the legacies of how the field of Slavic studies was mostly Russian studies, with everything else as an afterthought in most American universities for the more than century of the existence of the field, and how this is really a high time to change that. So this is not a simple process. This is something that is generating a lot of tension and friction, but it is moving, and there are very practical steps being made. But here too, we see situations that some, for instance, folks who were active as civil society activists after the Revolution of Dignity have experienced. So for instance, I know of colleagues who at other universities have tried to create programs for scholars at risk and bring in colleagues from Ukraine. And at first there was huge enthusiasm, and then the slowness of the university bureaucratic machine just overpowers, and their labor is not acknowledged, and the percentage of the outcome is far from what it seemed 2 months ago was possible. And but nevertheless, we persist. We still try, and there are tangible results. There also is a huge problem of coordination, where there are sometimes colleagues who are able to get goodwill of the university administration, but they do not necessarily have connections in Ukraine, or sometimes there is the situation where the administration has a vetted list. They need to have a vetted list of these the so-called scholars at risk in order to be placed. And in the context of the war, this is not something that you can always create quickly on the fly. So all these purely practical challenges. As for the leftist discourse and the perspective of anti-imperialist means anti-American, and therefore everything that is anti-American is structurally becomes something that I support. This has been a problem, but far less so lately. I think that the circles that strongly support that have really diminished in their size and in their power. And so those are marginal voices, but the change is still going to take a long time, but change is happening, and we see it in some places. So there is a progress despite resistance of the entrenched system, just the structural resistance, and resistance of certain stakeholders who are just very comfortable with the status quo ante situation and are not open to much change. But I think that overall, in terms of the field in the United States, I think the glass is rather half full than half empty. And one of the pleasant news in this not to make it about myself, but I recently received a phone call from Czech for participating in a plenary session at the next MLA convention, which will be in San Francisco. And I'm the only Slavist. So it's interesting that this is the kind of possibilities that open up tragically because of this war. We see the strong demand, for instance, for Ukrainian literature, that all the bookstores now all of a sudden, which never carried a Ukrainian book in the history, now feature not one, but multiple. But here too, we have the bottleneck situation where there is a sudden demand and you cannot churn out many books overnight. Creating books takes time. Academic presses are also notoriously slow. So we will probably have a big wave of important publications coming in half a year to a year, but there have been some that have been able to mobilize and produce something in the pipeline relatively quickly, but now we're still mostly relying on what was already in the pipeline before this new escalation of the war started. Anyway, thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you again, Valeria, for bringing us together.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. That was illuminating, Vitaly, and thank you for bringing in this case with the invitation from Kateryna Botanova. I think I saw a post by you, but I did not ask you directly, but I think that's indicative exactly of these changes that maybe not that drastic as we would want them to be, but they're there. And we should appreciate them as they're happening. So we ran out of our time. I would suggest that those who need to leave may do so, but maybe we can take another 10-15 minutes to have the closure, so to speak, to maybe to talk about like in a more free way. And is that okay for all the participants? Would you be generous with your time to give us some more time? So if anyone wants to ask a question, either speaking up, then you can just raise your hand in this reactions box, or you can write it in chat. So far, I have surprisingly a question to myself, what kind of statement by Judith Butler I had in mind. I could not find immediately this recent interview where the title of the interview is that I hope that the Russian soldiers would put guards down and would refuse to follow the orders from their officers. So the whole interview is made up in a very interesting way. No blatant, distorted sort of statement are there, but the whole focus of attention is definitely not on the Ukrainian side. So it gives a very specific impression of the stance of Judith Butler. I don't know if any of colleagues read that interview. Also, I received a question anonymously in direct message. So if any of you would want to address that one, how this full-scale invasion changed the urgency of the language matter. Because since we are talking about Ukrainians abroad, that many refugees coming in particular to Czech Republic speak Russian. On the one hand, the full-scale invasion makes abundant any colonial claims like culture and language, because we see a direct aggression, but at the same time, some people are very sensitive to that. So what do you think, if anything, has changed in terms of the language matter?
I can give you just example. It's not, I didn't analyze this issue, but I have a real life example, because my wife recollected the story when she entered Poland. She traveled by train from Kyiv with a refugee crowd, and there was a man from somewhere from Kharkiv, from East Ukraine, who was so moved by the very warm acceptance, but very warm meeting with Polish volunteers greeted Ukrainian refugees with coffee and pizza and accommodation and transportation. And he exclaimed very significant, made very significant statement. He exclaimed, "Вот это настоящие братья, не то что эти русские." So for me, this statement is very significant because he wrapped the new experience into the old formula, into the old cliché, which signifies, which means that people first of all acquire new experience, but still they lack the proper language. They cannot express this new experience in new form. They still use old cliches, there's a brotherhood and so on. So I feel it's very graphical, it's very typical, and which means that probably the language issue would lag behind the new experience. That's what I mean. But inevitably, new experience would change language practices and the very attitudes to the language. So this is what I predict, what I presume. So much.
Thank you. That was a very illustrative case, I believe. And also we have now a question in the chat box from Isabella Kalinovska-Blackwood, probably addressed to Vitaly, how we can make this moment last, that post-Soviet voices are included in post-colonial discussion. So what can be done about that?
Well, we try to seize the moment and advocate that this is needed, and this is there's both short-term and long-term work, and this is a chance. I mean, there is often, that means that there is a lot of pressure on those moments, but there is more of that outreach happening, and I think that we do have this kind of momentum now. The question is how to relate and how to, yes, seize this moment productively. I don't think I have a very elaborate answer beyond saying that just we realize that those kind of pressures, but this is something that a lot of again, Ukrainian writers have, written about this before. I'm thinking of both Oksana Zabushko and Yuri Andrukhovich, for example, writing a lot about this in the 1990s, when all of a sudden, yes, you are there in a public situation, you need to speak. But Zabushko's case actually is instructive here, because realizing that Ukrainian voices were missing from a dialogue between American and Russian and East European writers, she was invited as an afterthought to a conference at Rutgers University that was a continuation of the Lisbon conference, famous notorious one of 1990. And she did use that moment, and she did make a lasting impression, at least in terms of waves continuing. So every such moment is something where we take the chance and speak coherently and loudly. And we need to make sure that in appealing to those audiences, we speak, yes, just like Kateryna said, we humanize it, we give concrete examples. But I also think it's important to bring parallels to appeal to texts from the discourse, which is why, for instance, before we went live stream, I was mentioning Ngugi's essay on the abolition of the English department, which is why Kateryna and I collaborated on translating Said's Culture and Imperialism and bringing this to Ukrainian audience. And then this also was an opportunity to engage with folks on in the global post-colonial studies. So there is, I think, a change in that respect, but that is there is still a problem that Professor Kalinovska-Blackwood rightly formulated, in that there seems to be more eagerness on our side to embrace this than from the folks of the more established post-colonial studies to reciprocate. But when they do reciprocate, we just seize that momentum and I guess do the best we can to make a forceful argument.
if Valeria allows me, I will jump in with a short comment or kind of follow up on what Vitaly said, because I think it's very important also on Ukrainian side, not just be eager and willing, but really have a discussion about, decoloniality as a part of a discourse in the artistic field and literature and in the academia. And until recently in Ukraine, it wasn't the case. And I'm actually very happy that it's rapidly changing now over the course of 2 months. I would be more happy if there would be a different reason that we are where we are, right? So we're dealing with what we're dealing. And I think it's of immense importance that those questions that also we were discussing today are becoming more and more kind of on the agenda in the cultural intellectual sphere in general. Now the next step is also that we're not just talking about it, but that we are starting to talk and work with these issues more in a more informed way. And I say it also because I was working on the project on exhibition and serious publications in Lviv to open in August this year on decolonization of knowledge, and the project would be called Organic Communities. And when we started working on it last year, the idea of decolonial thinking and decolonization of knowledge was something so exotic to most of the colleagues in Ukraine. It was like, what are you even talking about? I mean, come on, this is not an issue. This is not important in Ukraine nowadays. So many other things are important. And now I'm thinking that this anthology that we wanted to translate and publish, if we did it a few months ago, it would be so on time, but we didn't. The book was supposed to be published in June, so we're a little bit late. But I do hope that when the war is over, we will not forget about those issues that we're talking about now. I mean, there will be many, many other challenges on cultural and intellectual agenda, but that we still remember that those discussions on decoloniality in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, they need to happen also inside Ukraine. And then from that position, we can also start talking and engaging in a discussion on different levels with our colleagues in Eastern Europe, in Western Europe, and globally.
Thank you, Kateryna. Yuliya?
I just want to continue what Katya said and what Vitaly said, because the shifts, these changes in the perception of post-colonial theory or decolonial theories, they are really huge. Because I remember when I was writing my book, and it was many years ago, it was like 2009, 2010, and I was presenting these thoughts at the conferences, and a lot of people, especially from Ukraine, were reacting that we are not post-colonial, we have nothing with colonial theories to do. It was really kind of a signal that, oh no, it's like, and now we are all talking about decolonial, post-colonial, and it's amazing how it shifted. And even Katya just mentioned that it was 2 years ago that that people were not really accepting this decolonial theory, but now everyone is just speaking about the decolonization of knowledge and etc. So I think that these changes are not from outside, they are inside Ukraine, so that we can see it like in both ways.
Yes, thank you, Yuliya. I very much support the idea that once we have this like huge increase in the interest to the Ukrainian society at large, that we should now make some conscious effort to structure it, maybe through some networks for more like meaningful distribution of knowledge or some frameworks, because right now it's quite sporadic and also at times mutually controversial. I can just give you anecdotal evidence from my own life that in late February, I was contacted alongside with a handful of other Ukrainian scholars by a German colleague saying that the DAAD meeting would be happening, how they should react to the full-scale invasion. And while I responded that you should start seriously thinking about decoupling Ukrainian studies and Russian studies to enhance your expertise on the region, basically, then my colleague, also a Ukrainian, writes, yeah, but you should also think about supporting Russian scholars because they are now discriminated heavily. So if we are promoting these sort of narratives, how would you imagine what kind of reaction would be on the other side? So that's kind of an open-end question that so far it looks very controversial to me, at least. We have another a question about the capacity of intellectuals to influence respective societies and through that respective governments and the decision making on the state level. And also a question, that was a question from Tatiana Shitsova, and another one from Yuliya Bidenko. To Kateryna, what is your personal attitude to projects or initiatives supposed to unite Ukrainian and Russian scholars at the moment? So whoever feels like starting answering either of those questions, please go forward.
I wouldn't call this question sensitive. I would call this question infuriating. But I guess, yeah, we all more or less know about it.
What I would say is that there are issues of ethics, and there are issues of indeed changing the paradigms of vision. So just in our field, I mean, some of it has to do with old narratives or organization of the field of Slavic and East European studies by linguistic principle rather than, cultural. And so they have not read, I guess, Shevelyov on the history of the Ukrainian language, and that, the theories about how Ukrainian language is supposedly so very close to Russian, indeed not a linguistic fact, but, is one of the imperial narratives. But yes, this is something where we need to appeal to different colleagues, and sometimes those are very well-meaning colleagues who, however, do not understand the situations where certain things are re-traumatizing. And yes, we have had a situation here on campus where several protests, the university is a secular university, but near the university are various religious organizations and different Protestant groups like Lutheran and Methodist and others wanted to organize a prayer meeting for Ukrainians and Russians to support them at the time of war. And I did not know this. I found out about this from one of our Ukrainian students, and we wrote, all of us, individual letters to those Protestant, pastors, saying that this is not a well thought through thing. This is like bringing relatives of the rape victim and a rapist in one room, and the relatives of the rapist might be very nice people and also condemning the crime, but just bringing them together in one space is disrespectful to those who are the victims. And they fortunately understood, canceled that event, organized another one, which was fully in support of Ukraine. It was not as well attended as we had hoped, but at least there was not that misguided one was averted. But these kind of situations happen a lot, and they often happen not out of maliciousness, but out of ignorance. And we try our, but no matter how painful and traumatic it is, we try, and often it is important to help people sort of come out of their perspective and look at things differently, because yes, a lot of it comes just from intellectual laziness and being used to looking at things a certain particular way. I unfortunately need to leave our meeting because I have to teach very shortly, but I wanted to use this opportunity to thank Valeria again and all the other amazing colleagues who I had a privilege of joining this panel with, and we'll continue our fight. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for being with us, Vitaly, and for all your inputs here. Thank you. I still see some raised hands, and I find myself in a very difficult position because I do feel that I'm abusing your time a bit and your willingness to engage, but probably we can do that shortly. Yuliya?
Yeah, many thanks. I just want to explain my position because I can see that Kateryna maybe was a little bit insulted by my question, and I really appreciate Dr. Chernetsky for his position, because I also face oftenly with such a situation when some of, let's say, organizers of panels or let's say conferences, they try to bring together Ukrainian scholars and Russian ones, and me personally, I refuse to participate in such events, but still, I think this position should be also promoted, you know, by Ukrainian scholars, especially those who well reputably abroad. So it is really, for me, it's really trauma, because I'm from Karazin University, which was partly destroyed by Russian, and when they want me to be in the same panel with those who, let's say, from the institutions who signed this application by Russian rectors, which supported the war, for me it's painful, and I think that it's also a kind of a battlefield for Ukrainian scholars as well. It's not the Russophobic, but still, I think that we need to show that it is kind of a sensitive question for our scholars at the moment, currently. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for explaining yourself, Yuliya. Your position is perfectly understandable and makes a lot of sense. I think just Professor Chernetsky gave us a broader perspective, because when the question is posed in a universal matter, then we need some nuanced and balanced approach. Thanks again. Bektour?
Yeah, first of all, I wanted to say goodbye because I had to go as well. But before saying goodbye, I just wanted to add something on that about Russians. You know, I've been mostly addressing, since, you know, the full-scale invasion started, I've been trying to address people in Central Asia a lot, explaining to them Ukraine from inside, because, well, I've seen a lot, you know. But there was one time when I actually tried to address some people in Russia, and I'm talking about indigenous people in Russia. Russia is still a colonial empire. It has more than 20 colonies, which are part of it. Well, of course, there is a room for debate whether they should be considered colonies, but I do consider them colonies, and I'm talking about republics of Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, you name it, Altai, Buryatia, whatever. And I once received this interesting request from my friend in Kyiv, who asked me, like, if I can find a translator from Buryat and Altai language for him, which I managed to find because I remembered that I actually know people from these republics who are very much resistant to what Russia is doing. I've then started researching, you know, what kind of independence movement have been going on in Russia in these republics, and I found some interesting stories about, you know, the Tatarstan independence movement, and all of this was suppressed heavily, especially since Putin came to power. Even slight talks, you know, like about any possibility of becoming independent from Russia would be immediately persecuted. But maybe we should think about, you know, somehow addressing this part of population of Russian Federation, because I also recently read a really interesting text about how indigenous people in Russia started, some of them, distancing themselves from Russia, who they don't want to be associated with Russians. And maybe this is a chance for us to do some really interesting work. It will be difficult, it will be risky, it will be maybe dangerous in some cases for these people, but this can definitely weaken Russia from inside. And I'm currently thinking about it, and I hope that we will come to something interesting. But this is a part of Russian population that I would be very happy to find, you know, the ways to work with.
Thank you, Bektour. Thank you. That's indeed very important. And I think that I will use this opportunity to close this conversation. We've been working for 2 hours now, and I completely agree with Kateryna that it had a very strong therapeutical effect to meet and talk, as we seem to speak the same language, not necessarily the Ukrainian one. And I love how easily we switched to English, seeing that we have quite an international audience. So once again, I want to extend my cordial thanks to my distinguished colleagues for participating in this event, and to our audience for your engaged listening and for your questions. Thank you all. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.